Good morning. I'm Pete Barquette, your MC today. Welcome everyone at Friendly House and on Zoom.
P. Believes strongly in freedom of speech, but the views expressed by myself, our reader, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. They're the official views of the NBA. And our reader today is the inimitable Al Christians.
Okay, this is from our article appeared in The Guardian on March 26, 2026. It's by Kevin T. Baker, and most of what I'm going to read here is absolutely verbatim from that article. Just a couple of things I'm going to insert on my own to clarify. On the first morning of Operation Epic Fury, February 28, 2026, American forces struck the Shajare Tabia Bay Elementary School in Ninab in southern Iran, hitting the building at least 2 times during the morning session. American forces killed between 175 and 180 people, most of them girls between the ages of 7 and 12. Targeting for Operation Epic Fury ran on a system called Maven. In April 2017, early in the first Trump administration, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert O'Rourke signed a memo establishing Project Maven. The Pentagon needed someone to build it. Google took the contract, and what happened next became the most visible labor action in the history of Silicon Valley. Maven was the most contested project in Silicon Valley. In 2018, more than 4,000 Google employees signed a letter opposing the company's contract to build artificial intelligence for the Pentagon's targeting systems. Workers organized a walkout, engineers quit, and Google ultimately abandoned the contract. Palantir Technologies took it over and spent the next 6 years building it into a targeting infrastructure that fuses satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and sensor feeds into target packages and moves them from nomination to strike. The building in Minab had been classified as a military facility in a defense intelligence agency database that had not been updated since at least 2013. Years after it had been walled off from the adjacent IRGC compound and converted into a school. Maven processed that list. This is what the 2018 protesters were afraid of. By the start of the Iran war, Maven had sunk into the plumbing and it had become part of the military's infrastructure. The real question is a bureaucratic question about what happened to the kill chain, and the answer is Palantir. Kill chain refers to the bureaucratic framework for organizing the steps between detecting something and destroying it. After Google abandoned the Maven contract in 2018, Palantir took it over. The benchmark was the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where roughly 2,000 people worked the targeting process for the entire theater. During Scarlet Dragon, a major U.S. military exercise held in 2020, as Maven was being implemented, 20 soldiers using Maven handled the same volume of work as the 2,000 people previously. By 2024, the stated goal was 1,000 targeting decisions in an hour. That's 3.6 seconds per decision. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, the fastest targeting cycle the U.S. had operated to that point in war, 50 leadership strikes. The bombs were precise. The intelligence behind them was not. Not one of the 50 killed its intended target. Alice Karp, the CEO of Palantir, describes exactly this achievement in the Technological Republic, published in 2025. Software is now at the helm. Karp thinks he is destroying bureaucracy. He is encoding it. The contempt for meetings and weekly reports and presentations to senior leaders. He treats these as the bureaucratic process itself. They were not. They were where people interpreted procedure, the place where someone could notice when categories no longer fit the case. The targeting doctrine is still there. The rules of engagement are still there. What Karp eliminated was the discretion the institution could never admit it depended on. And what he got was a bureaucracy that runs exactly as written. Encoded bureaucracy does not bend, it shatters. Congress did not authorize this war. In 3 weeks, American forces struck 6,000 targets. The school was one of them. American forces killed almost 200 people, and the reporting reached for was AI error, which domesticated the event into something a better algorithm or better guardrails could have prevented. Someone decided that deliberation was latency. Someone decided to build a system that produces 1,000 targeting decisions per hour and call them high quality. Someone decided to start this war. Several hundred people are sitting on Capitol Hill refusing to stop it. Calling it an AI problem gives those decisions and those people a place to hide.
Thanks, Al. A brief note about who we are. Humanism is an approach to life based on reason and our common humanity, recognizing that moral values are properly founded on human nature and experience alone. Humanism affirms the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. Since this is the only life of which we are certain, humanists believe that creative ability and personal responsibility are strongest when the mind is free from supernatural belief and operates in an atmosphere of freedom and democracy. And now I'd like to introduce today's program, Democracy and the Rule of Law. Democracy and the rule of law as we know them, although highly prized, are not automatically maintained and can come undone if systematically neglected or assaulted. It may be a long and complicated task to reestablish them with no guarantees. Today's presenter, one of our absolute favorites, has been a professor at Pacific University and the University of Texas, San Antonio, as well as a prize-winning documentary producer and reporter. Please welcome back Jeff Seward.
Well, my talk today, the full title is Democracy and the Rule of Law, Unnatural Acts Among Consenting Adults. Democracy is not the natural order of things. And it doesn't arise spontaneously if bad people are just prevented from getting in the way. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, there was a semi-articulated presumption that if we removed Saddam Hussein and purged the government and the military of Ba'athist militants, Iraqis would spontaneously and quickly construct a functioning, even model democracy that would then serve as an inspiration to spread democratic uprisings against all the other authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East. I don't know if you remember this kind of rhetoric, but I'm not exaggerating. All it would take really was to organize free elections, as if that is all that a functioning democracy requires or consists of. It didn't quite turn out that way. Instead, we got a chaotic situation that led to anti-US insurgencies, which we then had to fight for the next 15 years, and a series of semi-democratic elections that put in power Shia religious parties more or less allied with Iran, which of course was not our intent in invading Iraq. This seemed like a surprise to American policymakers, but it shouldn't have been. Democracy is not the natural order of things, and it can't be constructed overnight just by holding a single more or less free election. The natural political order, unfortunately, the order that springs spontaneously to life in a previously disorganized or disrupted society, tends to be civil war, conflict among competing gangs or warlords, as we're seeing in Haiti, for example, or the emergence of a strong leader who subordinates all the competing political forces to his or her authority. Even ancient Athenian democracy, often taken as the model that inspired modern democracy, was during its most glorious and successful period, essentially dominated by a single personality, Pericles, backed by his political machine of personally networked, powerful people. In fact, democracy and the rule of law, as opposed to the rule of persons, are profoundly unnatural acts, highly desirable, but also highly artificial constructs that can only be built painstakingly over a long period of time. The longer and more painstaking this process is, the more solidly democracy and the rule of law can be implanted. But it is important to remember that they are profoundly unnatural acts, and as such are fragile creations that can be dismantled much more easily than they can be constructed. Our own democracy, such as it is, was constructed over a long and tumultuous history. It took decades and an incredibly bloody civil war to overcome the profoundly undemocratic institution of slavery, and then another 100 years to dismantle the horrific terroristic institutions of racial segregation and one-party white supremacist dictatorship in the South. And the powers of the national government that have underwritten much of the success of the American experiment were often forged through extra-legal or barely legal presidential initiatives during wartime, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, or during the temporary near authoritarian moments when a president and a party enjoyed overwhelming congressional majorities, as during the Roosevelt administration in the Great Depression, or the first 2 or 3 years of the Johnson administration after the Kennedy assassination, when there was an overwhelming Democratic majority in the Congress, and we passed all the Civil Rights Acts, Medicare, Medicaid, and launched a war on poverty. It's also important to remember that our democracy has been a democracy only in a very limited sense. Our democracy is not really very democratic, never has been. Instead, we have elaborate social, economic, and political arrangements, most of them undemocratic, but infused with some limited democratic elements. In the beginning, the founding fathers were not actually trying to create a democracy, but rather a republic with a balanced form of government based on the principles of ancient and even modern political philosophy, that the best government should combine monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. So the president, as a single executive, embodied the monarchical principle. The Electoral College, the Supreme Court, and the indirectly elected Senate embodied the aristocratic element. And the House of Representatives represented the democratic principle. There also was not universal suffrage at the time. Slaves, women, and people without property were excluded from the vote in the beginning. We've become more democratic since then, but we still have the undemocratic Electoral College, the undemocratic Supreme Court, and the undemocratic Senate, in which the smallest 16 states have the same population as California, but they have 32 senators, while California has 2. And the tremendous influence of money in our elections ensures that the system is substantially more responsive to the interests of the rich than it is to the interests of the more numerous poor. Perhaps most important is that the main forces shaping our society and its future condition are decisions taken primarily in the private sector by large corporations in response to the pursuit of profit in a market system. So television, the automobile, the birth control pill, the internet, the personal computer, the iPhone, social media, the global financial system, and the emerging revolution of artificial intelligence have all been driven primarily by private decision makers and not through democratic institutions. The democratic features of our society that we do have were seen as protection against monarchical tyranny. And undemocratic features built into our Constitution and our system were seen as a way to prevent the democratic features from generating a majoritarian tyranny. One result is that our political order is filled with a lot more mechanisms for preventing decisive action than mechanisms for producing decisive action. The limited democracy that we have had has been sustained by a shared consensus about certain basic principles, a shared consensus among elites and the public. Basic principles like we're going to have a republic rather than a monarchy, capitalism rather than socialism, authority limited by checks and balances, etc., and by a belief in certain myths about ourselves and our system. A wonderful historian by the name of Edmund Morgan, in a book with a terrific title, I highly recommend this. It's a little dense, but it's called Inventing the People. And it's a highly entertaining essay about the transition from the ideology of the divine right of kings to the ideology of popular sovereignty, inventing the people. He suggests that all government authority, whether in dictatorships or democracies or whatever, all government authority is built on a voluntary suspension of disbelief, embracing what he calls political fictions. This is what he says. Government requires make-believe. Make-believe that the king is divine. Make-believe that he can do no wrong. Or make-believe that the voice of the people is the voice of God. Make-believe that the people have a voice. Or make-believe that the representatives of the people are the people. Make-believe that governors are the servants of the people. Make-believe that all men are equal, or make-believe that they are not. In order to be viable, in order to serve its purpose, he says, whatever that purpose must be, a fiction must bear some resemblance to fact. If it strays too far from the fact, the willing suspension of disbelief collapses. And conversely, it may collapse if facts stray too far from the fiction that we want them to resemble. Well, that's the end of the Morgan quote. Our fiction has always been that we have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to cite Lincoln's famous phrase. Less grandiosely, faith in our democracy depends upon the fiction that our elected leaders reflect the values of the people and can be held rigorously accountable to the democratic citizenry. This fiction's plausibility survived for a long time, partly because our system was so clearly substantially more democratic in this sense when compared to the autocratic arrangements in the rest of the world, especially in old Europe before it democratized. If we weren't completely democratic, we were still radically more democratic than any of the other major countries in the world. And the fiction was maintained by a substantially popular consensus about it and a pretty consistent elite propaganda reiterated in schools, public ceremonies, public media, July 4th celebrations, etc. This fiction of democracy as self-rule and complete accountability of elected officials to the democratic citizenry was never really true, but it had a certain plausibility when compared to previous fully autocratic systems. As we have lived with it, however, our belief in the fiction has worn pretty thin as we have become more sophisticated about seeing the non-democratic, even anti-democratic character of many, if not most, of our arrangements. We are also less enamored of this fiction because in many ways, American democracy has stopped delivering the goods. In the 20th century, American democracy conquered the Great Depression, won World War I, won World War II, won the Cold War, passed the civil rights laws that dismantled segregation, and made major strides towards full equality for women and LGBTQ folks. But what have you done for me lately? We've had failed wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, growing social and economic inequality, deep cultural and political polarization, a deadlocked political system incapable of carrying through any systematic reform program of the right or of the left. We face severe problems of fiscal constraint, seemingly intractable problems of immigration, demographic aging, climate change, economic stagnation, and growing inequality, and seem incapable of serious, sustained solutions to any of that. And it turns out people are more wedded to concrete results than to procedural principles. Democrats had a hard time winning elections where they just complained about Trump's assault on democracy. They wanted to know, what are you going to do about the cost of living and other concrete problems? People are only deeply wedded to democratic institutions when those institutions are producing important achievements that make life better for the public. What is natural, apparently, is not democracy, but authoritative leadership with positive results. And part of Donald Trump's appeal, in fact, has been that for a big chunk of the public, he seemed to promise that sort of authoritative leadership and those sorts of positive results. There's another problem facing modern democracy these days. I'm inclined to agree with a theory set forth in Arthur Koestler's novel, another book I highly recommend, Darkness at Noon, by the character of Rubashov. He's a former leading communist who's now a political prisoner awaiting disgrace and execution in a Stalin-like regime's prison. And this is Rubashov's theory of democracy. He says, the amount of individual freedom which a people may conquer and keep depends upon the degree of its political maturity. A people's capacity to govern itself democratically is thus proportionate to its understanding of the structure and functioning of the whole social body. He goes on to say, now every technical improvement creates a new complication to the economic apparatus, which the masses cannot penetrate for a time, and thus causes a fall in the political maturity thermometer. This sets back the masses in a state of relative immaturity and renders possible or even necessary the establishment of some form of absolute leadership. Well, if that's the case, how goes our political maturity these days? How goes our ability to comprehend the complex structure and functioning of the economic and technological features of the whole social body in which we live? Do any of us really understand how the global financial and economic system works? Do we understand the way social media is restructuring our social relationships? Do even the people developing the technology understand the future of artificial intelligence or the social and economic changes it's going to generate? Does anybody understand how cryptocurrency works? Can any of you actually open up the hood and repair your own car? If democracy depends upon the capacity of the public to understand the structure and functioning of the whole social body, we are in big trouble. It is becoming more and more opaque every year, while even our capacity to read and write and think appears to be deteriorating every year, as reflected in declining student test scores and the growing reliance on ChatGPT to replace our own writing and thinking skills. And all of this more or less predates the Trump presidencies or is outside of his specific outrages. This decline in the public support for government and democratic principles and the frustration about the performance of our democratic institutions really began in the 1970s and is reflected in public opinion polls about the state of the country. A survey taken by the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard showed that only 15% of young Americans, those aged 18 to 29, only 15% of young Americans trust the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time. The public in general, back in like 1962, something like 65 or 70% of the public thought they could trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. Now that number is like 25%. 68%, oh, this 15% was the lowest ever recorded of young Americans who to trust the federal government to do the right thing. 68% of young people say elected officials are motivated primarily by selfish reasons, with a share who strongly agree with that increasing from 26% in 2017 to 39% today. Just 26% of young Americans feel hopeful about the future of America. 26%. That's down from 55% just 5 years ago. The collapse cuts across parties. Hope among young Democrats has fallen from 78% to 12% in just 5 years. Even among young Republicans, whose party controls Washington, hope about the future has dropped by 10 points in the past year, from 67% to 57%. A Tufts University study of youth attitudes towards democracy found that only 14% of young women and only 19% of young men believe that the way democracy is in the United States right now is working well for young people. 14% of young women, 19% of young men. Only 36% of youth agree or strongly agree that US democracy today can address the issues the country is facing. One study of trends of all adults in the United States by a team of political scientists found that whereas 75% of respondents in the United States rejected a system of government with a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress and elections, 75% reject that, which means 25% accept it. In 1995, 75% rejected that. Now only 62% reject that. So 38% of the public agrees with it, that a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections would be a good thing. And while 94% of Americans agreed that democracy is better than any other system of government in 2006, now only 71% continue to do so. And then that was in 2019. Not, God only knows what the figure is now. So it went from 94% who agreed that democracy was the best system to 71%. And that was 7 years ago. But of course, Trump has greatly accentuated the already existing crisis of American democracy. I'm living in Uruguay now. I tried to develop a list of Trumpian outrages for a Uruguayan political science friend of mine. But the outrages were far too numerous. So instead, I sent him a list of categories of outrages and came up with 15 categories. Looking over them for this lecture, I realized they were a little out of date because they were 6 to 8 months old. So to update the list, I had to add 9 more categories. Not 9 more items, but 9 more categories. Here's a quick list. Trying to intimidate cultural transmission institutions, universities, museums, mass media. 2, using emergency powers embedded in various laws to do things never before done with these laws. Tariffs, immigration, the border, police and National Guard troops. 3, using executive orders to defy laws and even the Constitution on various subjects. Courts have ruled that the administration has violated court orders 31 times. And courts have ruled that ICE detentions were illegal 10,000 times, according to a survey that Politico did. 4, dismissing almost all the officials in federal administration who have jobs to investigate corruption or anti-ethical behavior, including most of the inspectors general of all the various departments. 5, dismissing personnel in independent agencies for partisan reasons who on paper can only be dismissed for cause. The most notable example was dismissing somebody from the National Labor Relations Board. 6, eliminating every program in government dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and bringing legal and financial pressure against universities and private companies to do the same, and declaring any program designed to deal with discrimination of any kind is illegal. 7, eliminating programs and even whole institutions that collect data or investigate issues of climate change or other environmental programs. 8, we're only a third of the way through here. Attacking programs of the government that project American soft power around the world, like the Agency for International Development, the Voice of America, the Institute of Peace. 9, attacking agencies that produce data inconvenient for the administration's economic narrative, most notably by removing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the employment figures one month. 10, attacking our traditional allies, Canada, Denmark, Mexico, Ukraine, India, South Korea, NATO, the European Union, while cozying up to enemy dictators and autocrats like Putin, Viktor Orban, Xi, etc. 11, censoring libraries and the curriculum of the military academies, West Point, Annapolis, Air Force Academy. I invite you to start making your own list. It'll take you a week, to get through. 12, nominating and confirming extremists for vacancies on the federal bench. 13, multiple assaults on the rules of the game for elections to try to avoid defeat in the 2026 and 2028 elections. 14, violating all kinds of norms about how a president should conduct himself, with unhinged late-night social media tweets, endless stream of out-and-out lies, vile insults against judges, left-wing lunatics and criminals, he calls them, sometimes even ones he appointed, and political opponents, even in his own party. 15, naming extremists and people without qualifications to his cabinet and other important posts. It's a long list. Pete Hegseth, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Kristi Noem for Homeland Security, Linda McMahon for Education, Carrie Lake for Voice of America, immigration guru Stephen Miller, FBI Director Kash Patel, National Director of Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, who just resigned, Economic Advisor Peter Navarro, and Russell Vought, whose name you may not know. He's the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and was one of the main authors of Project 2025. None of these people can you imagine possibly being appointed, even in another Republican administration like George W. Bush. 16, demonizing the opposition party, the Democrats, as illegitimate. And here I want to regale you with a quote from that famous Democrat, Stephen Miller, the president's Homeland Security advisor and White House Deputy Chief of Staff. He gave an interview to Sean Hannity last August and said this about the Democratic Party, which of course, like all Republicans, he calls the Democrat Party, not the Democratic Party. The Democrat Party does not fight for, care about, or represent American citizens. It is an entity devoted exclusively, that's his emphasis, not mine. It is an entity devoted exclusively to the defense of hardened criminals, gangbangers, and illegal alien killers and terrorists. The Democratic Party is not a political party. It is a domestic extremist organization, which is the way Hitler used to talk about the opposing parties. 17, weaponizing the Justice Department to launch spurious investigations or prosecutions of political enemies like James Comey and others. Starting a war in Iran without authorization by Congress and without consulting allies or even the Gang of Eight in Congress. 19, pardons of the January 6th prisoners, including those who violently assaulted police officers. 20, pardons of campaign donors and other white-collar criminals plus the drug-dealing ex-president of Honduras. 21, this is new, a slush fund for victims of weaponization of Biden-area prosecutors, including January 6th offenders. 22, multiple acts of self-dealing corruption that have added $1.5 billion to his net worth. 23, destruction of the East Wing of the White House without congressional authorization and construction of his ballroom. Chris Hayes the other day said he knows why he wants to construct this ballroom and finish it before his term is over. If the Republicans lose the 28 election, he's going to barricade himself in the ballroom and refuse to leave office. Chris Hayes hoped he was kidding. And 24, vanity projects all over Washington and putting his name on the Kennedy Center, the U.S. Institute of Peace, Trump-class battleships, large banners with his face on 3 federal buildings, Trump accounts for newborns, Trump IRA accounts for retirement accounts, passports issued in DC with his picture on them, national park passes now have his picture on them, Trump RX for discounted drugs that aren't actually very discounted, Trump gold cards for rich immigrants, renaming the Palm Beach International Airport for Trump, commemorative gold coins, and US dollar bills are going to come out, commemorating our 250th anniversary with Trump's signature on them. He apparently aspires to become like Big Brother in Orwell's 1984. Stephen Miller, again, accurately sums up the overall thrust of all these outrages. We're not going to accept any limitations on the president's authorities or attempts to reverse President Trump's policies. The president is not going to be constrained. There's a thoroughly democratic sentiment. Looking over this list, the closest historical analogy I can find, this is just unprecedented, not only in the United States, but anywhere. The closest historical analogy I can actually find is the first year of the government of Adolf Hitler. I know it's always problematic to make the Hitler analogy, but certain parallels to me are very striking. Of course, the first year of Hitler was much more extreme. He abolished all the other political parties. Clearly, Stephen Miller would like to abolish the Democratic Party. And he abolished all the unions. He threw several thousand political opponents, mostly communists and socialists, into concentration camps where they were tortured and some were murdered. Nothing comparable to that exactly has happened in Trump's first year. The parallel for me, though, is the fundamental impulse and some of the mechanisms used. The impulse was to subordinate every institution and every organized force in the society to the control of Hitler and his movement. And the main mechanisms were 2 legal emergency decrees that gave Hitler extraordinary powers to act outside the normal practices of the country, plus threats of violence, in his case, from 2 million brown shirts. An essential part of the process was called Gleichschaltung, translated usually as coordination or integration. Public and private institutions were forced to expel Jews and members of the socialist parties from their ranks and put followers of the Nazis in every position of leadership, thus trying to subordinate every institution of the society, political, economic, social, professional, and cultural, to the will of the Führer and the Nazi Party. Well, up to now, Trump hasn't gotten any new law giving him emergency powers, but he searches through every existing law for emergency authority that has never before been used, including going back to a law from 1798 designed to give extensive powers to the president during invasions, which is how he tries to label illegal immigration. He used this to declare that Venezuela was invading the country with the criminal gang called the Tren de Aragua. he used another law to declare an economic emergency to authorize his wave of arbitrary tariffs. And then he declared a crime emergency to justify putting military troops and FBI agents on the streets in Washington, D.C., and Memphis, Tennessee, and Los Angeles, and threatened to do the same thing to Chicago and New York. And there were 5 other declared emergencies, many more than any other modern president, all in the first year. Only a congressional law, which he could veto, can undo these declarations. The courts can decide that a law does not, in fact, authorize certain things, like the Supreme Court did about his tariffs. But in general, the courts are reluctant to challenge a political decision of an elected official about what constitutes an emergency. Our famous checks and balances don't appear adequate to block this type of behavior because the Congress is controlled by loyal or intimidated Republicans, and the Supreme Court is controlled by a pro-Trump majority that has acquiesced to most of his outrageous power grabs. One of America's most famous political scientists, a guy named Robert Dahl, died a couple of years ago now, he in fact insisted in his first major book back in 1956 that checks and balances are not what is responsible for the health of American democracy, but rather a political culture emphasizing a broad consensus among elites and the general public, and respect for informal political norms and habits that sustain civility and the constructive character of the system. Without these cultural values and norms, he claimed, checks and balances were not sufficient to protect the system. Donald Trump's behavior and the behavior of his supporters is unfortunately demonstrating the validity of this insight. Moreover, beyond these emergency declarations, Trump is attacking every cultural institution, universities, museums, including the prestigious Smithsonian Institution, the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the mass media, the National Endowment for the Humanities, et cetera, et cetera. There is a multidimensional, systematic assault on everything that maintains democratic institutions and democratic culture in the country, frequently following the blueprint laid out in Project 2025. And any person, even judges in the courts, even members of Congress, even members of his own party, who does anything against Trump is subjected to a wave of online attacks, including death threats against the critics and even their families, and in the case of Republicans, an end to their political careers. Beyond that, major opponents are being prosecuted on trumped-up charges, and he's even leveling charges of treason against figures like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. All of this has led to a decline in scholarly ratings of the quality of American democracy. There are several organizations that do these annual ratings, right? The Economist magazine, which is not a lunatic left-wing publication. It's sort of a centrist, pro-market, classically liberal magazine. It ranked Uruguay as the 15th most democratic country in the world, just between Canada and Japan. The US, it ranked 28th, between Malta and Chile. Uruguay was designated a full democracy, the US only a flawed democracy by The Economist. Freedom House, another group that does this, also a right of center organization, it ranks countries on a scale of 100. Uruguay ranked 97 out of 100, its score. The US score was 81 out of 100. The US was just below South Korea and Mongolia, and below most of the small nations in the Caribbean, like Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, Jamaica, and it was the same as South Africa. VDEM, another organization, put the US at number 57 on its list of democracies, just above Colombia and Guatemala. Uruguay was 13. Another recent survey on press freedom, in the last year, they put Uruguay at number 48, which was up 11 places from the previous survey. In the same survey, the US fell 7 places down to number 64 among countries on press freedom. The New York Times recently published an editorial looking at 12 markers of democratic erosion and decided that Trump had done things that made the index decline on all 12, bypassing the legislature, stifling speech and dissent, persecuting political opponents, defying the courts, declaring false emergencies, using the military at home, vilifying marginalized groups, controlling information, trying to take over universities, creating a cult of personality, and using power for personal profit. On all of these, they moved their index, farther in an authoritarian direction. That was the New York Times. But you say, Trump is experiencing declining popularity, and there's a good prospect of Republican electoral defeats this year and in 2028, if we actually have the elections. But let's imagine for the moment the optimistic case. The Democrats win back the House overwhelmingly and the Senate by 1 or 2 seats and elect a Democratic president in 2028. Restoring democratic institutions and restoring public support for democracy and our institutions will not be automatic just because the Democrats are back in power. It will be extremely difficult to undo the damage that Trump has done to the country and to our democratic institutions and culture. And remember, he still has 2.5 more years to wreak further havoc on the system. Why will it be difficult to put things back the way they were? Let me count the ways, as Shakespeare says. 1, it will still be difficult to move things through the Congress. It's not clear that the filibuster that requires 60 votes in the Senate to get anything, not clear that it can be eliminated. 1 or 2 Democratic votes, John Fetterman, for example, could prevent that. Then 60 votes would still be needed in the Senate to pass anything, and there'd likely be continued deadlock. Secondly, executive initiatives would likely be blocked by conservative judges and the Supreme Court, as they did with campaign finance reform, as they've just done with voting rights, as they did about Medicaid expansion when Obama was president, as they did when they rejected Biden's student debt relief proposal, and their major questions doctrine that says regulatory agencies can't institute a new rule if it's a major deal. They have to go back and get specific authorization from Congress, which, as I said before, is likely to be deadlocked. Third, Supreme Court reform may be very difficult to pass with just 1 or 2 seat Senate majority, and will appear highly partisan. To expand the court enough for a liberal majority would require 4 new justices, a blatantly political move, and Republicans could just retaliate when they return to power by creating 2 additional conservative seats. We may end up with the Supreme Court with 83 justices as each party tries to leapfrog the other by adding more. And this would also severely increase the delegitimation of the Supreme Court and make it look even more than it does now as essentially a political body. The Chief Justice the other day gave a speech in which he said, it's terrible that people are now saying that the Supreme Court is political. Yeah. Right, John. Fourth, it will be hard to fix the delegitimation of elections, courts, mass media, universities, technical expertise of all kinds. The public no longer has confidence in any of those things, and just electing a Democrat isn't going to suddenly restore public confidence in elections or the courts or the media or universities or technical expertise. 5, prosecution of crimes committed by Trump and his administration will just reinforce the narrative of weaponization of the Department of Justice and lead to retaliation by the first Republican administration that comes along afterwards. Restore diversity, equity, and inclusion, very difficult and controversial. I don't think it will happen at all in the private sector. It's too risky for corporations to sort of go back and forth by installing this stuff and then deinstalling it. And any progress in that direction would be reversible in the next Republican administration. Passing billions of dollars to reconstitute the Agency for International Development? Good luck. Foreign aid is highly unpopular among the American public. It may be very hard for Democrats to say, let's allocate $20 billion to get foreign aid back on track. That's a vote they're not going to want to take. 8, reestablishing scientific expertise on disease control, reestablishing the legitimacy of the Center for Disease Control, reestablishing scientific expertise on climate change, medical and scientific research. It'll take lots of money, and the credibility of these institutions is deeply damaged. And what professional would want to risk their career again by returning to the federal government when they know at the first Republican administration they're likely to all be fired again? And 9, there will be a temptation for the Democrats to further erode democratic norms by following Trumpian precedents, only in a progressive direction. But that will further delegitimate key institutions and culture. This will not only be a temptation of the Democrats, they'll also experience a lot of pressure from the Democratic base to do the same things that Trump did, only in the other direction. I want to end with a story from Uruguay, since that's where I live now. Last year, they elected a new president, returning the progressive coalition to power after 5 years of conservative but sensible and responsible government. The conservatives in Uruguay are not insane. As part of the inauguration ceremony of the new president, he invited all 4 of the living ex-presidents, 3 from opposition conservative parties, and 1 from his own progressive coalition, these 4 ex-presidents, to join him on stage to celebrate the contribution of each of these ex-presidents, each from a different political party, to the restoration of Uruguayan democracy. They were celebrating the 40th anniversary of the end of a military dictatorship that they had that fell in 1985, and celebrating the current healthy state of Uruguayan democracy. In his inauguration speech, the new president emphasized the value of Uruguayan democracy and its institutional stability. He said, every 5 years, citizens have elected their leaders in a civic festival that makes the republic proud. This is a country of political parties, alternation in power, and agreements. A country in which trust continues to be a central element for its functioning. That is why we say that Uruguay works. He also thanked the former presidents of the last 4 decades, including the outgoing president that he was replacing, as well as 2 deceased presidents, 1 conservative one and 1 from his own progressive coalition, for their contribution to the strengthening of democracy. And he finished by saying, thank you, democracy. Thank you, republic. Thank you, political parties, for making this Uruguay a plural amalgam of coexistence that still amazes the world. I watched this on television. It was so moving. It almost brought me to tears as someone who is trying to become an Uruguayan. Can you imagine Trump doing anything like that with Clinton, Bush, and Obama and Biden at his inaugural? Can you imagine a future Democratic president including Trump in such a ceremony? Hope not. If we are lucky, In 20 to 25 years, some US president will gather together all the post-Trump presidents, Democratic and Republican, to celebrate each of their contributions to overcoming the Trump catastrophe and restoring a full and healthy democracy to the country. That's if we're lucky. Personally, I find it hard to imagine that that is going to be our trajectory. I am afraid that the Trump era, and to some extent the decades that preceded it, have done permanent damage to American democracy in a way that we may never fully recover from. And to close, I want to leave you with a cynical quote from Oscar Wilde that may unfortunately describe well the future of our deeply polarized politics. This was his definition of democracy. Democracy means simply the bludgeoning of the people by the people for the people. Questions?
Okay, let's go to the question number 1 here at Friendly House.
Okay. Okay, number 1.
Sir John Glubb, who's passed away, was a person who studied the fall of empires. He and others have done this over time. And his research on like 13 or 14 empires is they last about 250 years, and they followed 7 steps, and we're following them to a T, and it's almost to the day of 250 years. Yeah. Do you think it's just inevitable that our empire will not survive, and that maybe now the Chinese will take over, some other empire will fill our void?
I think it's inevitable that America will not be the dominant power in the world forever, or that our basic institutions will survive forever. I mean, it's not been the history of any great power. I'm a Latin Americanist by trade. You know, the Spanish Empire, you know, stood astride the world, and it fell apart, and Spain has become, you know, a backwater second-rate country. And the Roman Empire fell apart. No, there's no guarantee that any current arrangement of power will go on forever. My wife and I visited China in 2017, and I had been to China since 1976, and China in 2017 was unrecognizable. And the roads were great, and the airports were fabulous, and the speedy trains were incredible, and there were wonderful buildings going up everywhere. And everybody was starting their own business that we met. And my reaction at the time when we left was, China's coming for us, and we're not responding in any kind of systematic or effective way. I do think that the 22nd century is likely to be an Asian century and not an American century.
We had on the chat, someone wanted to know the name of the author of Inventing the People.
Edmund Morgan. Edmund, like the kid in the Tales of Narnia. Edmund Morgan, Inventing the People.
Another on the chat comment, I think we all want to move to Uruguay now.
They're welcoming. They're slowly losing population as young. They're churning out a ton of university graduates who can't find professional work and are going to the United States or Spain or Brazil somewhere. So becoming an immigrant is really easy.
Question number 2 here.
So FDR was the last president who I think threatened to expand the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court at that time were made up of a bunch of libertarians who were basically vetoing every progressive move that he tried to make. And he was doing that because he was trying to overcome a Great Depression. Now, do you think if the Trump economic system creates something equivalent, a modern equivalent to the Depression, that will allow more progressive democratic principles to reemerge.
Well, it didn't help FDR pack the court. He lost, and he had an overwhelming Democratic majority in the Congress, and he still had to back off. The Supreme Court, though, which as some scholars said, reads the election returns without changing its composition, although he added one or two, it backed off and started saying, well, maybe some of these New Deal things are constitutional. I don't see this Supreme Court backing off at all. And they're young, except for Alito and Clarence Thomas. And if they see the lesson of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and resign before Trump leaves, then they'll appoint two more young, aggressive, conservative Supreme Court justices. And that 6-3 majority can last for 30 years.
A question from Mike Berchet: would multiple secessions from the U.S. preserve democracy within themselves and let the rest of the U.S. rot?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of Cascadia. If we could create Cascadia, Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and appropriate British Columbia, I might come back from Uruguay. But, it's not going to happen. One of the things that the Democrats would like to do to fix the Senate a little bit is make the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico states. That would be 4 new, presumably Democratic senators. There's a little known fact that when Texas came into the Union, it came in through a treaty. And this treaty allows Texas to divide itself up into 5 states. If they did that, they would have 10 senators. And I could imagine the Republicans saying, well, let's do that. It would be unthinkable in a previous era. But if the Republicans and Democrats are in a tit for tat about new and strange things to get a political advantage, why not break up Texas into 5 states and get 8 additional senators?
Oh boy. Oh, Mike adds, seriously, I do plan on visiting Montevideo for a week. Just my luck, I'm stuck at home recovering from surgery while you're in town.
Well, I'm recovering from surgery too. I lost a toe in Uruguay.
Oh, brother.
Oh, my goodness.
There's Mike.
I'm still on serious antibiotics.
Question 3.
I wanted to ask you about the brain drain on the government institutions. How can we fix that? I mean, particularly, the FBI and all that. So the people that really were independent thinkers and, not political thinkers, and they're all gone now, from what I can understand.
I think it's going to be very hard. If you were such a person, would you want to go back and take up a job now, even under a Democratic administration, knowing that no telling what will happen in the future if the Republicans regain the presidency? And all of those people who left, people have 20, 25 years of experience in disease control or climate change research and so forth. They're highly skilled people with wonderful resumes. They've all got new situations. They found a place in a university or a think tank or a private industry with lots more money. Why would they leave that to go back? So it's going to be very hard to restock. It's going to be very hard to restock the Department of Justice with experienced lawyers to again begin to enforce what's left of the Voting Rights Act or other anti-discrimination. They've just gutted the Department of Justice and the FBI of anybody who was involved in any of the Russia investigation or any of the Trump prosecutions. They're gone. They're now taking, used to be you had to have some legal experience to get a job in the Justice Department. Now they're taking fresh graduates out of law school, and they're still short of attorneys to do the work that they're doing.
Just a follow-up. You mentioned a book by Rubishaw, and I didn't get the name of the book.
He's a character in the book.
Oh, he's a
The
character.
book is by Arthur Kessler.
Okay.
Oestler, called Darkness at Noon. One of my favorite books.
Question number 4.
So my wife and I have had a lot of conversations about like the state of our financial situation, where we live in the world, what's happening with the government, what's happening locally, federally. And, you know, since graduating high school, I've encountered like 3 major economic disruptions. Like we've been unable to accrue retirement. We've been set back multiple times. I lost my job nearly 12 months ago, and we've been unable to recover, right? Going from comfortably middle class to where we are today. And at nearly I'm just about to turn 40 at the end of the year, and I've got a 7-year-old daughter. We need guidance. And I guess my question would be from you, like, if you were in our situation, what would you do?
I'd study Spanish and move to Uruguay.
So leave is.
But I mean, of course, for me, it was easier to
Abroad as a retiree, you know, if you're not a retiree, well, you've got to go abroad and then get a job in a foreign country in a foreign language. I would say try to construct a career for yourself online in some ways.
you're mobile, so
Yeah.
you could do this job anywhere in the world. And then if you don't want to learn Spanish, you know, move to some other reasonable country like New Zealand would be high on my list. But you know,
Dwindling number of places you can move to as well. All the European countries are in crisis as well. Canada's too damn cold. You know, I don't have any advice for you. I don't know that things are going to get better here before they get worse for, and you're not that young, but people coming out of college are having a terrible time finding appropriate jobs. And companies are beginning to lay off people. I'm glad I'm retired.
Are you going to share presentation, by the way?
yes, it'll be online and archived.
No, a video of the presentation, so you can go watch it over again as many times as you like. Use it to put yourself to sleep at night.
Yeah, we've got all these on YouTube, right? Yeah.
And there's quite a few of I've given like 25 lectures here over the years, and most of them are archived online. And most of them are future predictions of democratic catastrophes. There's one that's not online. I wouldn't let them record it because I was afraid it would get me in trouble. The title of it was The Making of an Un-American, Why I Want to Move to Uruguay, but My Wife Won't Let Me. That was 2015, before Trump got elected.
Wow. Question number 5.
Jeff, one of slavery has never been dealt with in our country. You know, we've never said, I'm sorry, we've never paid reparations. Where do you see that going in this country? This them and us, this I just find
Well, it's really good because we're wiping out that history altogether.
We won't be divisive anymore. You know, I was very discouraged during the campaign. Reporters started asking candidates whether the United States was a racist country. And Nikki, what's her name? Nikki Haley, who is of Indian background from India, she said, no, America's not racist and never has been. She knows better than that. She faced racist discrimination the whole time she was growing up in South Carolina. And Kamala Harris said, yes, America's never been racist. I mean, come on. This is just so ridiculous. I mean, America's history is full of lots of virtues We've made a ton of progress. We fought a civil war to get rid of slavery. We dismantled segregation. We've expanded people's rights. We've deepened our democracy. We've won a couple of world wars against terrible global forces. We have lots to be proud of, but we have a deeply racist past and a pretty deeply racist present still. And to say all discussion of the present racism or past racism is to be outlawed is just one of the worst symptoms of our democratic decay. And I think it's going to be hard to bring that back. I think of, there's 3 or 4 courses that I taught that if I were teaching them the same way today, I'd be worried about a horde of right-wing protesters showing up and saying, you're teaching illegal things, and why isn't the university shutting down your course? Some guy, I think it was at Texas A&M, was forbidden to teach Plato in his philosophy class because Plato was positive about homosexual love, and in his ideal republic, he was abolishing the family. And therefore, it was outrageous that a university course was being taught in which such doctrines were being spread. And I've read a number of stories about university professors who either voluntarily or due to pressure from their administrations are either ceasing to teach their course or are radically constraining what they say in the classroom and what they require students to read. And they purged all the courses about racial discrimination out of the military academies and out of the military libraries, military academy libraries, so that cadets, which were getting a halfway decent education about these things, are not going to get any instruction about those things at all. And any attempt to bring back any of that will become instantly controversial. So there'll be a swarm of controversy around a university saying, damn it, we're restoring our DEI office, even if they put a new name on it. And so it won't be an easy slog to just say, well, Trump's gone, so now we'll go back to the way things were. That DEI now has become a permanently delegitimated phrase. And so people are afraid to touch anything that remotely smacks of it.
I missed one here. From Kurt Mackey. Why do fascist tactics continue to work on the public, even though the tactics are seemingly well known?
Well, they aren't working very well in most of the public. Trump's approval rating is down to about 35%, and some it's even lower than that. But the fascist base always liked fascism. The stormtroopers never turned on Hitler, although he turned on them at one point. And so what you see in the polls is that his support among the MAGA Republicans is holding pretty firm. It's declined slightly, but he's still got 85, 90%. But among independents, among non-MAGA Republicans, his approval ratings are cratering. Among Latinos, his approval ratings are cratering. Among young people, it's cratering. I don't think, though, that cratering is mostly due to his anti-democratic, quasi-fascist moves. It's cratering because of the price of gasoline and the price of mortgages and the cost of living and difficulty young people finding jobs and things like that. So it's quality of life, cost of living things that are declining. To simply say, well, he's doing undemocratic things doesn't seem to generate a lot of public response, which is discouraging.
Number 6.
Fine, and you covered it. I just want to know how to move to Uruguay.
Well, I moved to Uruguay. I hired an immigration attorney, paid him $3,000,
And then he paid all the fees out of that $3,000. They weren't that much anyway. I arrived in Uruguay on a Wednesday. He had set up an appointment for me with the immigration office for Friday. I went in on Friday. A week later, I got my preliminary identity card that said this man is applying for permanent residency. Once I had that card, even though I was not yet a permanent residency, I had all the rights of a permanent resident with that card. 6 months later, I got a second card. I can't remember what it called me, but it basically said, he really, really is planning to be a permanent resident. And then after a year, I got my final permanent resident, essentially green card. I have to renew it in 3 years, but I now am a permanent. So it could not have been easier. And my immigration lawyer, took me to set up each of my meetings, went with me, dealt with the person. And that was the best money I spent. So it's very easy. You have to prove that you have enough money to sustain yourself financially, but it's a pretty low number that they require. You don't have to invest $100,000 and so forth like you do in some of the European countries like Spain and Portugal and so forth.
And the attorney with Oracle.
He was a Brit, actually.
Married to an Uruguayan woman who's lived in Uruguay for like 20, 25 years. I can give you his name. Really nice guy. And he introduced me. He was, I wanted to join the golf club there. Uruguay is pretty expensive in some ways, but it's cheaper than here. I always wanted to belong to a country club. I used to have a photo in my office, on the back of my office door, of Che Guevara in full guerrilla battle uniform with military boots on, leaning on a golf club on the Havana Country Club course. I said, well, that's me, right? They have a beautiful country club right in the heart of Montevideo that's like a 15-minute walk from my house. It was designed by a famous Scottish golf architect who was one of the architects of Augusta National, where they play the Masters. It is in wonderful condition, has 2 swimming pools, clay tennis courts, basketball court, a billiard room, several restaurants, all kinds of fitness things and so forth. In the United States, to join a country club of this quality would have an initial fee of at least $150,000, maybe more. It's $2 million for Mar-a-Lago. This one cost me $4,500.
Does it have pickleball?
And so, but I had to have a recommendation for a member. Well, it turns out my immigration lawyer was a member, and his son was an officer of the club. So they recommended me, and I got in. And then he introduced me to another member of the club, who's a British guy who lives around the corner from me. He's like a block away, and we have tea together once a week in the mornings.
But you never played politics, right?
But I never played. And he was the director of the British English Language Institute in Montevideo for like 25 years, knows everybody at the embassies. He was an important enough British person that whenever British dignitaries came, he would be at the reception. He met Queen Elizabeth and Prince Andrew and Prince Charles and all of these people when he was, he's retired now. Great guy. And so we get together once a week. I have a group of American expat friends too. And a good friend who's a Uruguayan political scientist that I hooked up with years ago. And so I actually have more of a social life in Uruguay than I had in Portland when I left.
Well, we don't quite have time for the last question, but we'll sneak it in. And luckily it'll be brief because it's from Al.
Mr. Trump is an advocate of spectacular change. Why haven't we heard anybody talking about constitutional convention?
Well, constitutional conventions
Are really dangerous. Years ago, like in the 1980s, people who were in favor wanted a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. They decided the easiest way to do this was to call a constitutional convention. And you needed, I think, 39 states to call one. And they were up to like 34 or 35 states. And then constitutional scholars started weighing in and said, you know, if you have a constitutional convention, you cannot restrict it to that one item. If you have a constitutional convention, it's the people's sovereignty embodied. Just like the original Constitutional Convention, they were supposed to just tinker with the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they threw it out and wrote a whole new constitution. And that would happen again. Do you really want a national constitutional convention to start from scratch and write a new constitution and go through the Bill of Rights? I don't.
But I think
Chile had
The new constitution. They wrote two new constitutions because they had a big political crisis. The first constitutional convention was dominated by the fairly far left. They wrote a very progressive constitution that then was put to the people and was rejected like 60-40. So they had another constitutional convention dominated by the conservative right. They put together a constitution and the people rejected that one 60-40. So they're still working on coming up with a new constitution. That's, I think, the worst way to go. And I don't think he could get one approved. You know, if Trump said, I want a constitutional convention, no Democratic legislature is going to approve that. And he'd need 39 states.
On that cheerful note, we
Yeah, that's
want
a
to,
positive. See, I can be optimistic.
yeah, we do want to thank you. We had another comment in the chats asking that you come back again. And
I will be back in February, and I would happy to do a post-mortem on the November elections, plus whatever has happened in the wake of the November elections.
oh, wonderful. Thank you.